This is the Thiessen Building in downtown Pensacola. It's the site of a bizarre incident and a conspiracy theory that maybe we're about to get to the bottom of. Hank Killam ended up dead, and we have no idea why. But it had something to do with the JFK assassination. Hank Killam's name is a footnote in the annals of the JFK assassination story. I did a short version of this when we toured Belmont de Villers a while back, but I wanted to revisit it because we may be about to find out what really happened. Yep, it's a conspiracy theory's dream come true. President Trump has delivered on one of his campaign pledges by signing an executive order on January the 23rd to release the remaining classified files related to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The executive order demands that the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence present a plan within 15 days for the full and complete release of the JFK assassination records. We actually don't know how long it's going to take, but I'm hoping one of Pensacola's most unresolved mysteries is going to be in that hall. It would be about time that we got to the bottom of this story. Here's what we know. Hank Killam was born in 1922 and grew up in Pensacola. Well, he was actually born in the small town of Century, and his family struggled to make ends meet. They later moved to Pensacola, eventually ending up on Romana Street in downtown. Hank's father passed away in the 50s, and several of the children moved on, but by the 60s, he and his brother Earl lived with their mom, Mary. Earl was a used car salesman at the Plymouth dealership. Hank otherwise got in trouble for burglarizing a car dealership and got off pretty easy with probation. He just didn't stick around to see his probation through. He wanted to get out of town, and luckily his brother Clayton was living in Texas. Fatefully, he went to Dallas. Now let me get this right out of the way right here. I'm not a big one for conspiracy theories. I'll put that another way. I really usually don't believe in conspiracy theories. It's not that I don't mistrust authority, it's just that I don't think there's a whole lot of masterminds out there. So I'm going to leave all the different theories out there for the other channels to explore. But I will say this, if somebody was in the position to know something about something, even by accident, it was Hank Killam. I do love Venn diagrams, so check this one out. Killam's connection to the assassination stemmed from his association with Jack Ruby, the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Killam's wife, Wanda, worked as a stripper at Ruby's club in Dallas. He also worked with a man named John Carter, who lived in the same boarding house as Oswald. Now let's look at those connections just a little bit deeper. John Carter was a house painter in Dallas. He hired Hank in 1963. Carter lived in the same Dallas boarding house as Lee Harvey Oswald. He hung out with him, so occasionally Hank hung out too. John was friends with both Jack Ruby and Wanda Davis. Wanda Davis worked in Jack Ruby's Carousel Lounge in Dallas. She sold cigarettes, and then she stripped as well. It was a burlesque club. Now, the papers made a big deal about Wanda making $300 a week as a stripper, which is about $3,000 in today's money, so it was pretty lucrative. So Hank also knows Jack Ruby, Hank knows Lee Harvey Oswald, and Hank knows Wanda. So Hank marries Wanda. Ruby ended up letting Hank go because he wants a stripper's husband hanging around all the time. He eventually even let Wanda go because Hank was apparently still hanging around even after he was fired. According to Sergeant Mike Simmons' book about Hank, which I will put in the comments if you'd like to read, he suggests that Jack Ruby felt bad about firing the both of them, so he later gave Hank a job running information back and forth to New Orleans. This was a situation in November 1963 when President Kennedy was assassinated. After the assassination, Hank became convinced that he was being targeted. He believed that agents and plotters were following him around, and he lived in constant dread of being killed. They continually showed up at his home and his work to question him. He said they wore black suits, so we know what that means. This is all coming from Hank. According to Wanda, he was not sleeping, and he was obsessively reading the newspapers, looking for anything there about the assassination, clipping out the stories. We know he was obsessed with what had happened. And you may wonder if he was just that type of guy who was going to see conspiracies, especially when he knew the players involved. Some researchers have suggested that the people who tend to believe in conspiracy theories are the sort that really like to have a feeling of control. He could have just been the type, and then he was very close to the action. But what did he really know? He was bothered enough that he decided to leave Dallas. He went for a while to Tampa to live with a sister, but those people were bothering him there, according to Hank. He eventually wound up back in Pensacola with his mother and his brother Earl. Remember, he had a warrant in Pensacola, so he really wanted out of Dallas. When he got to Pensacola, he told his brother Earl, "I'm a dead man, but I've run as far as I'm going to run." Something or someone was really bothering him. Things went from bad to worse with Killam, and eventually Killam's mother called the police to her house on Romana Street, claiming her son was acting irrationally, wouldn't sleep, was really having problems. The responding officer's name was Sergeant Reeves, and he went out and talked to Hank. He calmed him down, got him to go to bed because he was going to go to see a psychologist the next day. Now, Mary ended up calling Reeves back to the house at 3:40 in the morning. She had fallen asleep, and Killam had gotten around her. She said she heard the phone ring, then she heard her son get dressed and go outside. Finally, she heard a car drive off. They did not own a car. So Sergeant Reeves said he would go around downtown looking for him. But what were they looking for? They didn't have a description of a car. An hour goes by. Now, two men were out working in the early morning hours. They were sweeping the street at Palafox and Romano, and they heard what they thought was a truck picking up beer bottles and whiskey bottles. But when they turned around, they saw a man staggering from the window of the linen store. At the same time, a large piece of glass fell. This is at the Thiessen building at Intendencia on Palafox. Understand, this is only 3 blocks away from where Hank was living on Romana Street. When Sergeant Reeves got there, of course, he recognized Hank right away. Hank was alive, but he couldn't speak. He was taken to the Escambia General Hospital, where a doctor said a single 3-inch cut had severed his left jugular vein. Now, this is odd in itself. There was only one cut, a single cut. The window was broken, but there was no club, there was no rock, and there was blood 4 feet inside the store. If Hank had jumped through the window, well, first of all, why would he do that? And why wasn't he more cut up than he was? Did he trip and fall through the window? Understand, the window was set a foot above ground, so he'd have to trip up to do that. Did somebody throw him through the window? And if they did throw him through the window, still, why didn't he have more cuts? Why was there only one cut? The linen store with the display window that he fell through or jumped through or was thrown through had some sheets and some blankets, and there was a sale going on, and this is the weirdest part of the story. Exotic locations and faraway lands was sort of the theme of it, and the theme was actually Africa, but they had a shrunken head in the window for this sale. Now, just why they would use shrunken heads to sell sheets, I don't know, and it wouldn't be Africa. It would be Ecuador or Peru if you're talking about shrunken heads. I don't know, the whole thing is weird, but there's been a lot of speculation that the shrunken head comes into the story. He had barbiturates in his pocket, and maybe he was hallucinating and he saw the shrunken head and it freaked him out and he threw himself through the window. Okay. You know, oddly enough, there was no report of Hank's death at the time. Nothing in the paper. You would think there would be enough curiosity about this thing to at least make it into the paper. Maybe the police didn't want that. The police listed the death as a suicide. The next day, the county coroner, A.H. Northrop, listed the death as accidental. This is another weird thing. He didn't know until 1967 that the police had signed a report listing probable suicide as the cause of death. He didn't know that for 3 years. He thought the suggestion of suicide was ludicrous. The body was unmarked except for the throat cut. The death was listed as accidental, cause hemorrhage from a cut jugular and carotid artery. Dr. Northrop said, I've seen a suicide where a man put blasting caps in his mouth and lit the fuse, but I've never heard of a man trying to commit suicide by jumping through a plate glass window. In 1967, Earl made a request for exhuming the body. Now, this may have been because he was hearing the stories out of New Orleans when Jim Garrison was reviewing it. As New Orleans DA in late 1966, Garrison had begun an investigation into the assassination after receiving some tips that a man named David Ferry may have been involved in the assassination. You can see all this in JFK. Escambia County Solicitor Curl Harper went back to investigate. Now, that was covered extensively in the paper. He went to New Orleans and he went to Dallas as part of his investigation. Now, when Harper went to Dallas, he talked to Wanda, and Wanda told him that an autopsy would serve no useful purpose. After all, she was a stripper, so let's listen to her about crime scene investigation. She may not have known what was best for the investigation, but she maintained that her husband would never have committed suicide. She also told him that she did not feel that her husband was remotely connected with the Kennedy assassination. But she said, he was my husband. I'd sort of like to know what happened. This is great. This is even more interesting than what Wanda had to say. This is in the same edition of the newspaper. Tonight's the night for UFOs. Wednesday night is the best night to see UFOs in the Pensacola area. A watch is set up for 8:15 tonight on the scenic highway bluffs, just across from the cemetery. They note in here that most flying saucers reported have been over that general area. In answer to some calls on Tuesday, binoculars should not be necessary, but sunglasses may be helpful for the bright silvery saucers. Apparently at 10:30 p.m., on Tuesday, 2 Marine captains had reported UFOs headed over North Pensacola. Apparently, no UFOs were spotted, and Harper didn't come up with much either. He concluded that since Hank had barbiturates in his pocket, he was on drugs, and that shrunken head in the window was enough to send him flying through it. That's what we know, which is not a lot. What we don't know, did Hank really know something? And if he knew something, what did he know? Were people really bothering him? Did he commit suicide, or was he killed? Was it just a weird freak accident? And will the release of the JFK papers be able to answer those questions? What do you think? Please put that in the comment section and let us know. And while you're there, please like this video and subscribe. It helps us bring you more content. We appreciate it. And getting back to conspiracy theories, I will say, as someone who has a background in both communications and in protocol, there's something to be said about transparency and keeping calm and following protocol. Protocol is there for a reason. The whole idea behind protocol is in great times of emotion, you can easily go through the steps to make sure everything is done by the book and correctly. Many procedures were skipped or discarded in the panic surrounding JFK's assassination. Then there was a lack of transparency. One of my favorite sayings about transparency is, if you don't feed the dogs, they're going to go through the trash. As we've seen in countless murder investigations, and we're seeing it throughout history, but we're seeing it today as well. While there's often good reason to withhold some evidence from the media, if you say nothing, that vacuum will be filled with conspiracy theories. That can be dangerous. It can ruin lives when the wrong people get accused and gossip is repeated online. We may not ever find out what really happened to Hank Killam, but if we do find out when the papers are released, we're going to come back with a second segment. So be sure to subscribe so you'll be notified. We appreciate you. Catch you later.